Right guys, stand there, right? Got you, right? Right, lover boy, turn round.
I can't, I'm in.
He has to come.
Right, okay then, this is, I'll take it in work mode. There you go. Good show.
Okay, Steve, I haven't got a seat allocated to you.
Okay, just tell me where to go.
Excuse me, I've got a seat down there, but I'll be standing taking photographs, so he's more than welcome to take mine, which would be B4 or B5.
Maybe on here somewhere, I take it.
I'm Alan McMillan. It should be B4.
Yeah, there it was on this side.
B4 side and 13.
Well, 13 is
Aye,
Kathleen's
so-
got. I got that ticket for Kathleen.
Alright.
I was just going to say, have you got a ticket?
No,
Yeah,
we're just sorting that out.
Steve, you can have B4 or
What do you think?
So actually it'd probably be easier just to go around the back. That's just easier, yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here, and good afternoon to those of you out there in Zoomland as well. I think there'll be a fair few. And can I just say it's wonderful to have the lecture back in real life again after our online adventures last year. My name's David Francis. I'm Director of Tracts, Traditional Arts and Culture Scotland, which is resident in this building, but I'm also the regular compere at Edinburgh Folk Club, hence my appearance this afternoon. A couple of wee housekeeping things. You're requested to keep your mask on at all times. Could you check that your phone is off? And as I say, just to let you know that we are being live streamed this afternoon. I don't think that will affect anybody in particular, but just to let you know. And yeah, so Hamish Henderson, as you probably well know, was born on the 11th of November 1919, and in honour of that, the Carrying Stream Festival was set up by Paddy Watt in 2002, so this makes this the 20th Hamish Henderson lecture, the first one done in 2002, as I say, by Fred Freeman. And the Carrying Stream Festival was the brainchild of Paddy Watt, who was such a motive force for Edinburgh Folk Club, and made this particular weekend a really notable expression of love and appreciation of what Hamish Henderson had done. A lot of love and appreciation as well for Paddy, who we dearly miss, and I just was reflecting today that it's a real tragedy that Paddy never actually got to do the Hamish Henderson lecture himself. I'm sure that would be wonderful. Paddy produced several books about Hamish Henderson. We have one of them upstairs, copies of it for sale upstairs, Carrying Stream, and also a book of Dundee rhymes, street rhymes and so on, collected by Margaret Bennett, one of Hamish's great colleagues. And another colleague of Paddy's who was very much involved in Hamish matters is Steve Byrne, and I'm delighted to welcome Steve onto stage now to give us a couple of songs before the lecture. Steve Byrne.
Per lad Jensen a lad say tram, aye the ha the jelly floor, aye the time. A per lad Jensen a lad say tram, if lud a lassie that lud na hem. She says, "Gae fetch to me your rogue, aye the ha the jelly floor, aye the time." She says, "Gae fetch to me your rogue, your mother's helped to feed my dog." To his mother's house gaed that young man, aye the ha the jelly floor, aye the time. To his mother's house gaed that young man, and he cut out her head and awa he ran. Now as he ran he tripped and fell, aye the ha the jelly floor, aye the time. As he ran he tripped and fell, and the head that rolled on the ground as well. Now the head that stuttered against a stain, aye the ha the jelly floor, aye the time. The head that stuttered against a stain, and the laddie had Ed Macinet's mane. Now the head was greeting and crying full small, aye the ha, the jelly flour, aye the time. The hat was greeting and crying full smart. Are you hurt, my Byrne? Are you hurt at all? That was Hamish's translation of an older poem by Jean Lichepin, I think published in the 1930s, but older themes really about maternal love in European folklore. And thanks to Dave for mentioning Paddy so readily today. That very first lecture in 2002, I was a 23-year-old, 24-year-old by that time, traditional arts officer for the City of Edinburgh Council. Nae beard, wee bit less hair. But, it was a pleasure to basically, I think at that time, you know, we talked about it being a recognition for the first time of Hamish amongst the ordinary folk of Edinburgh that came along and has continued over the last 20 years. So, and huge thanks to Paddy and especially to the Folk Club for keeping that legacy going. This song is the second piece of poetry or song that is contained in a book called Halala Madiba, which is published to celebrate artistic works referencing Nelson Mandela. And quite an auspicious week, I suppose, with the passing of F.W. de Klerk to sing it today. And Hamish was right in the vanguard. He wrote this already in the early 60s, before apartheid was really a mainstream thing. And when I was working on the Hamish Henderson papers, there's a large broadsheet which has an early draft of the Freedom Commolio, which only has 2 verses in it. And it was so early in the apartheid kind of awareness that they managed to misspell the word apartheid on the broadsheet. So Hamish was definitely in at the very beginning. And it's set to the Spanish Civil War tune of Viva la Quinta Brigada, and it's about the Rivonia trial. They have sentenced the men of Rivonia, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a, the comrades of Nelson Mandela, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. He is buried alive in an island, free Mandela, free Mandela. He is buried alive in an island, free Mandela, free Mandela. The crime of the men of Rivonia, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a, was to organise farmer and miner, against prescription book and Giri, free Mandela, free Mandela. Against prescription book and Giri, free Mandela, free Mandela. Fair God feared the mind of Mandela, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. He is stifling the voice of Mandela, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. Free and Becky Goldberg's a student, free Mandela, free Mandela. Free and Becky Goldberg's a student, free Mandela, free Mandela. Set free the men of Rivonia, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. Break down the walls of their prison, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. Freedom and justice are who, free Mandela, free Mandela. Freedom and justice are who, free Mandela, free Mandela. Power to the heirs of Lutuli, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. The comrades of Nelson Mandela, rumble-a-rumble-a-rumble-a. Spear of the nation and broken, free Mandela, free Mandela. Among them Congo is seized with free Mandela, free Mandela. Spear of the nation and broken, free Mandela, free Mandela. Among them Congo is seized with free Mandela, free Mandela.
very much, Steve, and there will be more from Steve later on. As I mentioned, this is the 20th Hamish Henderson annual lecture, and I think it sort of marks a passing to a new generation in many ways. A generation for whom direct contact with Hamish was minimal, if at all, but for whom Hamish remains an inspiration both as a scholar and an activist. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce an honorary Highlander, but probably always a border lass in her heart, and certainly an activist and scholar in her own right. Please welcome Mairi McFadyen.
Thanks, Dave, and it really is wonderful to be back here in the Storytelling Theatre and to be giving this lecture in real life. It's really wonderful. As Dave mentioned, I never actually met Hamish Henderson himself, yet his presence has really loomed large in my life and my work through the people that I've met, through the people I've learned from, all the people who've carried me along the way, and it's just so nice to see quite a few of you in this room today. So. He actually passed away the year I began my university career, studying in a department that was formerly the School of Scottish Studies, where Henderson obviously was a founding member, a place that I really called a home for, I think, more than 12 years. And through this connection, in some small way, we ethnologists really feel like we are inheritors, in part, of at least some of Henderson's legacy, if we can lay claim to that. So my lecture today is going to reflect on the diversity of this legacy, his vision, his activism, and the importance of the political traditions and really the political potential that his work has come to embody today. So hopefully, if you can hear me at the back okay, give me a wave. We're all good? Fantastic, thank you. So for those of you listening who might not know, I'm sure everyone in the room does, Henderson was many things. He was a poet, a folklorist and folk song collector, a scholar, activist. He was a soldier in World War II, which would influence his lifelong commitment against fascism. He spent time in Italy, where he would discover the work of Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci. He is perhaps best known, though, for his involvement in the Scottish folk revival and the collection of Scotland's songs and folk culture. And as musician Martin Bennett said, if it hadn't been for Hamish, much of what Scotland's culture today is would be lost. His activism was always political as well as cultural, however. As Steve mentioned, he campaigned against apartheid in South Africa. He was active in the peace movement. He championed the causes of cultural equity, equality and gay rights. He agitated for a Scottish republic, for the dissolution of the British state, and for the British Empire, and for a reckoning with its imperial and colonial legacies. And as Alison McMorland recalls, recounted in Tim Neat's biography, for Henderson, he believed that the two most important developments in his own time were the women's movement and the environmental movement, which is interesting to notice. In his writing, he imagined a more equitable, decolonised, post-imperial and therefore post-capitalist world. As Corey Gibson in his book has written, his method to deploy these ideas rested in part on his ability to make a ceilidh of a moment, which I think is a lovely phrase. Henderson believed that his own finest work of art was his contribution to the People's Festival ceilidh, People's Festival, his Gramsci in action as he called it, gathering people together in convivial spirit. And this is an idea I'll come back to before the end of today. Before going on, I might just start with the personal, because it's important to me. I remember sitting by the fire in my granny and papa's house watching the telly, and on the TV there was a documentary about Hamish Henderson, and he was explaining how the words of the song Farewell to Sicily came about. Farewell ye banks o' Sicily, fare ye weel ye valleys and shaw, there's nae jock will mourn the cows o' ye, poor bloody squaddies are weary. My dad said, "Isn't that amazing?" And my papa leaned in and said, "Do you know what's even more amazing? I'm right up the back there, I was there." He was a sergeant in the catering corps, a quartermaster in the desert campaign in North Africa and Italy. And this is a photo of my grandfather, Nelson Gray, right at the front here, holding the placard protesting against nuclear weapons. He was active in the peace movement. And through my mum's side of the family, I was also involved in the peace movement since I was wee. She took me on peace marches, she took me to plant daffodils at Fast Lane, we made rainbow warrior cakes, and so this has been very much part of who I am and where I come from. My grandfather actually went on to work in TV and introduced Hamish Henderson to my dad, and my dad's a poet and gave me a love of folk music, of poetry. And I say this not to make any claims or for vanity, but to just deeply acknowledge where I come from and how my own story connects with the carrying stream that winds from the past into the future. This idea that the past is ever present. As Dave mentioned, every generation encounters ideas from the past in their own historical context. The carrying stream is a constant flow of exchange, a dialogue between past and present, where understanding is continually recontextualized for new times and meaning is continually renewed. So that is important to keep in mind, I think, for the theme of my talk today. Because of course, we are living through really turbulent and deeply troubling times and find ourselves at a pivotal moment in human history. The global pandemic upended life as we knew it. Normal life became about masks and social distance, learning to smell with your eyes, and the pandemic also laid bare the multiple and interconnected crises that we were already living in and through. It stripped away the illusion of safety, of security, and exposed the fault lines of inequality, discrimination, and injustice at home and across the globe. Frustration with government's responses encouraged questioning of political and economic systems and fueled calls to address legacies of police brutality, of racism and colonialism. And then the Black Lives Matter movement, now recognised as the largest social movement in global history, catalysed a great deal of collective learning, acknowledging both the history and legacy of slavery, as well as the inequities based on the racial ideology of white supremacy that persist in our society, social structures and institutions today. The backdrop to all of this is the climate emergency. Code red for humanity. As the last IPCC report stated, the alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Global climate crisis is inevitable. It is happening now, and we are on the trajectory towards the destruction of the biosphere that supports all life on this planet. I don't know about you, but it takes a lot for me to stand up here and talk about this and not just start weeping. And like many of you, I'm sure, in recent years have been cycling through stages of grief and despair, searching for ways to make sense of it all and how to respond. The dust has not yet settled on COP26. In fact, I haven't even checked the news to see if it's actually finished. This was billed as the make or break moment to put us back on track, the last chance to turn things around. Events were taking place all over Glasgow. There was so much energy and the voice of the people was loud and clear, yet, as perhaps expected, the official diplomatic event was only a spectacle, an exercise in PR, in grotesque hypocrisy at points, in greenwash and deception. Business as usual. It's, of course, far too soon to make sense of it all just yet, but it feels like we're at an impasse. As Greta and fellow young Indigenous activists declared in George Square last Saturday, global leaders will continue to fail to address the climate crisis unless they are prepared to confront its root cause, an unjust economic system, global capitalism, a system that was born out of and continues to thrive upon empire and colonialism. Climate change contains within it histories of enslavement, extraction, exploitation, as well as colonial systems of power that continue to perpetuate oppression, inequality and injustice across the world today. Climate justice is social justice, is migrant justice, is indigenous justice, is racial justice, is economic justice. It's a systemic crisis. The Heelstergowdie, it's great that we can laugh. The Heelstergowdie upending of our lives has revealed what we already knew. Our system is completely broken. We cannot go back to normal, and we need to find ways to do things differently. It's a matter of life and death. Now, I hope this isn't too crude a link, but it's really difficult to look past here Henderson's song of internal, eternal and elemental conflict, reflecting the life and death, finished in 1963. It is a poetic expression of living with mortality and takes on new meanings, speaking more than poetically to our time. Life as sunshine claims the world. Death claims it for pain and for hunger. Life says that there's plenty for every child, but death offers instead war and pestilence. Life reminds death that every grave is a furrow to be sown again. The song, of course, is commonly sung and known by a tune by Alison McMorland, and actually Laurie Watson sings an absolutely gorgeous version. But Henderson said of his own melody that it resembles the urla or ground of a pibroch, the solo music for the pipes. So I'm hoping Maria is going to help me play a wee clip, just a wee shot. It's not the full thing, just a wee clip to bring in Henderson's voice to the room. Oh, this is the tab along the top. It was the tab that was... Oh well. There it is. Thank you. There we go.
What life, the world is mine. The flowers and trees that I'm in. I am the day and the sunshine. What life, the world is mine. What death, the world is mine. Your lugs are deaf, your een are blind. Your flowers mun dwine in my bitter wind. What death, the world is mine.
Click on view. View. Oh, no. Click on the lecture. Yep. And then click on view. View. There, that's it. Present. Right, I'll find it. Thanks, Maria. I love listening to these archive clips. I'm sure you've all spent loads of time exploring Topper and Delish. Okay. Since 2018, I've been part of a collective called Enough, hosting upending conversations, building networks and exploring ideas and action around alternative economies, degrowth, decolonisation and climate justice. We have a journal called Less, and I've brought some with me today if you'd like to take one. We're connected into different forms of activism and social change, but our core message is this: growing our economy is costing us our future. Economic growth is the defining characteristic of contemporary societies. Governments measure their success on their ability to deliver it through GDP, but at what cost? There's significant evidence to show that economic growth cannot be decoupled from environmental harm, as some might argue. Leading Marxist theorist David Harvey calls the idea of compound growth the madness of economic reason and the most lethal of capitalism's contradictions. It's a death cult based on hyper-consumerism, gross inequality, catastrophic carbon emissions, ecocide, omnicide. I've got a short video to show you, produced by the activist collective The Rules, which explains this far better than I could.
Our world is a diverse place, brimming with ideas and stories. But isn't it strange? When it comes to economics, for some reason, we've all ended up settling for the same system. A single story. Capitalism. Here's the thing. We tend to talk a lot about what it does. Private enterprise, advertising, stocks and bonds, the market. But we talk a lot less about the why. What is the deep logic that makes capitalism tick? It all comes down to one golden rule. The purpose of capitalism is to grow more capital. That's it. And where does capital come from? You have to choose to squeeze it out of the world. Choose to squeeze it out of the land and the seas, out of the human bodies and the other living creatures. Wring it out of time itself. Politicians have a cuddly sounding euphemism for this. They just call it growth. And they tell us it needs to be 3% every year or the system starts to break down. That doesn't sound like much, but 3% per year actually means doubling the size of the global economy every 20 years. Doubling the cars, the smartphones, the air miles, the plastics. It doesn't take a genius to know that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. We're already taking far more than can be replaced. And we can see the consequences all around us. Climate change, deforestation, soil depletion, perpetual war, the mass extinction of species. It's got so bad that we're now threatening the foundations of all of life itself. It doesn't have to be this way. In fact, it can't stay this way. We have a choice to make. Prioritize growth or prioritize life. We can't do both. There are so many different options out there, from new types of money that undercut the drivers of growth, to regenerative farming to rebalance our food systems, to new ways of measuring progress and well-being. One thing is clear, the era of treating capital as more important than life is coming to an end, one way or another. If we are going to survive the Anthropocene, it will be because we create post-growth economies that allow us to flourish on this beautiful and generous planet we call home.
Despite the fact that the IPCC Code Red states that we need pathways to rapid and unprecedented social transformation beginning now, urgently, right now, its strategies to mitigate the worst of climate impact continue to assume economic growth as if there is simply no alternative. But there are compelling and viable alternatives. Degrowth is based on a radically different logic to the market of profit, efficiency, greed, competition, and begins instead with the assumption that the purpose of the economy is to provide people with what they need to sustain their livelihoods. It calls for equitable downscaling of the economy to one that does not exceed planetary limits, leading to a future where we can all live better with less. There has been little debate about degrowth in Scotland, but the movement has growing momentum in Europe, in Germany, Spain, France, Italy. And we can learn a lot from our European friends, especially at a time when, with Brexit, it's vital to nourish and maintain our continental connections. And as my colleague Mike reminds us, despite its green aspirations and credentials, Scotland remains a petrochemical economy being held ransom by a retrograde, hardline, and corrupt British state. For mainstream economists, the first connotation of degrowth is recession. Other critics dismiss it as a form of green austerity, but no, degrowth is not asking people to be voluntary poor. It is asking what we need to thrive. It calls for investment in infrastructure and systems that support the flourishing of life. As economic anthropologist Jason Hickel writes, another contradiction of capitalism, while austerity calls for scarcity in order to generate growth, degrowth calls for radical abundance in order to render growth unnecessary. Degrowth, then, is a call for radical abundance and for human freedom. In recognition of the enduring coloniality of North-South relations, degrowth critiques are specifically directed at the high levels of energy and resource use in the global North, which are vastly in excess of human need. It calls for resource and wealth redistribution, rapid decarbonisation, and protection of our ecosystems and biodiversity. It calls for an end to destructive and extractive industries, an end to our taxpayer-subsidised fossil fuel industry, the dismantling of the military-industrial complex. It promotes instead regenerative alternatives to monocrop agribusiness and proposes radical policies such as universal basic income, a 4-day week, active travel and public transport, affordable homes, the decommodification of healthcare, of food, culture, education, all that we rely on as essential. Degrowth also calls for a reimagining of our conceptions of work, prioritising life and sustaining care work, child rearing, caring for the elderly or the sick, tending to the neighbourhood and the environment. This, of course, is the invisible labour, as feminist economists point out, to which we all owe our existence. This is all to say, of course, that many of the key ideas underpinning degrowth are not new. This is not a new story. It has its roots in a range of anti- and alter-capitalist thinking, such as ecological economics, feminist economics, post-colonialism, eco-socialism, social ecology and anarchism, anthropology and design, as well as traditional and indigenous practices. It also has a foundation in common with many political traditions, struggles and forms of resistance. It is a politics of solidarity with trade unions, class struggle and workers' rights, with intersectional struggles of race, gender and disability, with migrant, refugee and asylum seekers' rights, as well as environmental activism and climate justice. The thing is, degrowth doesn't impose universal models, but rather looks for practices that emerge first from specific and local contexts, the so-called global pluriverse of local resistance to the monoculture of global capitalism and Western cultural imperialism. There are many ideas and movements that present real alternatives to the status quo, particularly across the global south. This means that what degrowth looks like in Scotland might look quite different to elsewhere, given its particular historical challenges. We have, for example, high levels of inequality and one of the most unequal distributions of land ownership in the West. I was teaching a session for the Centre for Human Ecology a few weeks ago, our Degrowth in Scotland online course. My own field, Henderson's field of study, ethnology, is intimately connected with human ecology, a subject, as my colleague Luke describes it, that considers the relationships and ruptures between nature, culture, society and economy. A radical human ecology involves a grounded understanding of people and place. While degrowth is perhaps an idea only emerging in a Scottish context, we can contextualise it in the history and thought of activism in Scotland, the long story and carrying stream of resistance in both urban and rural, lowland and Gaeltacht contexts. From Mairi, Byrne and Oran to Mairi Barber, John McLean to Jimmy Reid, Sorley McLean, Patrick Geddes right here in Edinburgh, we are certainly not short of inspiration. And in my own classes, would you believe it, Henderson is right front and centre in beginning discussions about our degrowth future, a Scottish cultural degrowth. His most famous work, The Freedom Comology, as we know, was dedicated to the peace marchers in the 1960s, but the values and vision it celebrates transcend any one decade. It speaks to the entire anti-capitalist movement from Marx's time to our own. Henderson himself described the song as expressing my hopes for Scotland and for the survival of humanity on this beleaguered planet. Described as rebel bardic, it is a song of freedom, of justice and peace, imagining all that has to be overcome. The international reconciliation of races and continents, decolonisation, and liberation from the excesses and exploitation of human life under late capitalism. The song tells of a rough wind of change blowing through the great glen of the world, which will upend and unseat those in power, sweeping away the troubled histories of imperialism. It, of course, acknowledges Scotland's complicity as a military force in the British Empire, where the Scottish soldier is both imperial cannon fodder and colonial oppressor. It calls out the extravagances of the rottens and rogues in power, who are rich off the back of the poor, the marginalised and the oppressed across the world. All of you who believe in freedom, it says, never heed the prophets of doom, imagined as hoodie crows. Capitalism is the only way, they croak, with all the deathly cynical pragmatism of those who tell us we have to keep extracting oil to balance the books. Henderson prefigures, instead, a world of global solidarity, of ecological harmony, love, dignity, humanity, the flourishing of life in all its forms, where, in the last line, the oppressed brings down the oppressor, and a black lad beyond Nyanga dings the fell gallows for the burghers' doom. The foundations of such a profound and vital transformation will come from intimate human connection and collective human will. The Camallie is an incitement to gather, to rise. The song, of course, also contains within it memories of a radical heritage of resistance, including the great hero of Scottish socialism, John Maclean. In his famous speech from the dock, he said, "My contention has always been that capitalism is rotten to its foundations and must give place to a new society. I consider capitalism the most infamous, bloody, and evil system that mankind has ever witnessed." One of the main aims of ecological thinking is to bring forward the many and diverse forms of knowledge and culture that are overshadowed or have been silenced by dominant narratives of empire, of colonialism, of progress, of globalization. As well as rethinking economics and economic relations then, a cultural degrowth is also about reclaiming a cultural inheritance, that which might have been lost in the name of progress. It is also about seeking out those cultural practices and ways of living, working and being that restore life and community, that restore balance. It is important to emphasise here though that this is not about a nostalgic return to a romantic, imagined pre-industrial past, but rather about reclaiming radical, rooted and life-affirming practices in a contemporary context, looking to the future. Recovering traditional ecological knowledge helps us become more attuned to our local environments. Such knowledge includes, for example, ecological agricultural practices, how to grow food, where and how to make homes, traditional crafts, names and knowledge about local flora and fauna. Research, of course, has shown that cultural and biological diversity are intimately linked, and vital in this context too is the importance of culture, of language, cultural memory, imagination, myth, meaning, music, all those diverse forms of creative expression and collective consciousness that sustain and nourish our internal worlds. Archives, of course, are a wonderful repository of this knowledge, and there is so much to be found in the School of Scottish Studies archives, digitised online in the resource Toper and Dilipish. The importance of local ecological knowledge and creativity was perhaps first widely popularised, certainly, by folklorist Alan Lomax in his appeal for cultural equity in 1972. Here he is with Hamish Henderson in Edinburgh's Old College Squad, possibly after we've been off doing some folklore collecting somewhere. I'd love to know the story behind this photo. At this time, of course, post-war, post the Second World War, there was a growing concern that the world's cultural diversity was being diminished by these processes of standardization, huge economies of scale, decentralization of education, powerful entertainment industries, and global mass communications. Lomax writes, "With the disappearance of each of these systems, the human species not only loses a way of viewing, thinking, and feeling, but also a way of adjusting to some zone on the planet which fits it and makes it livable. Not only that, we throw away a system of interaction, of fantasy and symbolizing, which, in the future, the human race may sorely need." Today, these words, of course, take on urgent and new meanings. The future he speaks of is our today. Our society has become so cut off, so alienated from the environment, from the cycle of the seasons, from the agricultural year, from the natural world of which we are all a part and depend upon for our life. The degrowth practice then of finding, reclaiming, reviving and reinventing traditions embedded in the landscape is one way to begin to mend this relationship. And this to me is the work of my own field of ethnology. For example, this was a harvest festival hosted by the fern growers on Far Community Allotment just south of Loch Ness a few months ago. With help from farmer Colin Gordon and creator of many lovely things, Ranich Sandilands, this community has been exploring the growing and harvesting of heritage grain varieties best suited to this particular highland climate. It really was a joyful day filled with work, food, music and song, the repairing of old harvest songs with their original practices. That's incidentally my wee baby girl in a wheelbarrow. And it was the first day that we all completely forgot that the global pandemic had even happened. It was really magic. Traditional seasonal community festivals, as we know historically, often embody these values of cooperation, of stewardship, of generosity, hospitality, reciprocity, and these are all degrowth values. At the heart of it all is a life-giving conviviality. Degrowth looks towards the revitalisation of community, of democracy and ecology, and embodies the vision of a radical transformation towards a just, sustainable and convivial society. I'm going to pick up on this word, conviviality, one of my favourite personal words. In his editorial introduction to Henderson's collected essays Alias Michaelius, Alec Finlay writes that Henderson's natural conviviality was a cultural force. We often use this word to simply mean the joy of coming together socially, of being lively and friendly, which of course it does mean, but it has other life-affirming dimensions too. Much of what we value in terms of a quality of life is still created outside of the spaces of economic exchange through the voluntary association of friends, neighbours, citizens. The restrictions of the pandemic, though, hugely limited our spaces for conviviality, our libraries, village halls, pubs, local clubs, festivals, public spaces for gathering and assembly. And yet, at the same time, in the face of all the fear and anxiety of the COVID-19 pandemic, and despite social distance, we witnessed a huge collective solidarity, a desire for cooperation and working together. New civic and local mutual aid groups blossomed all over the place, affirming that we are and always have been connected in a tangled scheme of social relations. We depend on each other for life. The International Convivialist Manifesto, yes, there is such thing, it's fabulous, which was translated from the French, defines conviviality as a transformative art of living together that would allow humans to take care of each other and of nature, but without denying the legitimacy of conflict, but using it as a kind of creativity or dynamizing force, a creativity sparking force. Its declaration of interdependence argues that a convivial society requires a realignment of the relations between state, economy and civil society to allow the flourishing of forms of self-organisation within communities to this idea of reclaiming the commons. It's possibly the topic for another lecture. Discussions of the concept of conviviality often refer back to the works of Ivan Illich. Tools for Conviviality, of course, is the title of a book which is a classic of social critique and political ecology from the 1970s, exposing the flaws in technology, capitalism and economic growth. To be convivial is to live with, but it is not just to live, it is to thrive. Social interaction doesn't have to be mediated, the mediated relation of people as things in terms of exchange and use. In such an economic system, everything, every person and every place is seen simply in terms of resources at hand. This tendency, this pathology even, of our capitalist society, of turning relationships into services, culture into commodity, human into machine, has been described by common scholar David Bollier as the great invisible tragedy of our time. Our local and national governments, cultural institutions, organisations, creative industries, education system, universities have largely been captured, co-opted and colonised by this ideology, this way of thinking, this new orthodoxy of new managerialism, the mode of governance explicitly designed to realise the neoliberal project. The patterns of capitalism are so deeply ingrained in our consciousness that we sometimes don't even recognise it. The end game of this process is the enclosure of the mind, the enclosure of the mind, the enclosure of what our sense is of what is possible. To croak for doom. The absolute triumph of this system is demonstrated by the fact that so many of us have lost the ability to even imagine our way out. As Naomi Klein has written, we are locked in, politically, physically, and culturally to the world that capital has made. Or famously, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Okay, coming back to Henderson. One way to illustrate this dynamic of conviviality is to talk about the Scottish tradition of the céilí. In Gaelic culture, as we know, the verb céilí simply means to visit. Traditionally, the taicéilí or céilí house was the building block of community through the long winters, with music, song, storytelling, dance if there was space in the kitchen, and of course news and gossip. In more modern times, especially within a Scots context perhaps, the word céilí has come to mean more of a big social dance. Stan Reeves has written about this, particularly in relation to the educational pedagogy of Paulo Freire and his work with the Adult Education Project, of which Henderson was a part, which became the Scots Music Group here in Edinburgh. And this is a picture of my local village hall in Breakin, in case you're wondering. For Ivan Illich, convivial tools are those which give each person who uses them the greatest opportunity to enrich the environment with the fruits of his or her vision. The céilí was Henderson's primary convivial tool, if you like, his ability to make a céilí of a moment. He celebrated the céilí as an organising principle in his activism because it is intuitively democratic, egalitarian and participatory. Given the right circumstance and the right kind of host, a community can be created by a disparate group of people in quite a short time. Henderson championed the lived moment of the céilí gathering. The lived moment of the céilí gathering, the creative aliveness of performance and its reception of shared, embodied, common experience. When it came to the carrying stream of the folk tradition, it wasn't so much about the songs themselves, although these of course were important, but about the singing of them. Again in Aelius Michaelius, Finlay writes, for Henderson, this lived, shared moment was a moment of resolve, of transformation, of insurrection, and it could occur whenever a song is shared, for in the sharing the song is reborn. This moment is a proving ground for all emotional and political truths. It gifts us our common humanity, our insurrectionary awareness that freedom becomes people, for, as his own song foretells, all the roses and genes will turn to bloom. It is on these occasions that we become aware, if only fleetingly, that we are here, that we are very much alive, that we are connected. Ethnologists or anthropologists might call this experience communitas, and you just know it when you feel it. It has been variously described as the sense of sharing felt by a group when their life together takes on deep meaning and collective awareness. A moment in and out of time, the experience of in-betweenness, the gift of togetherness. There's something really magical about it. For many people, of course, music, song, dance are particularly potent cultural forms, a kind of fast track to this experience of joyful communitas, but it happens in other contexts too. A shared or common task, for example, learning together, a community festival or event. Anthropologist Victor Turner describes communitas as a kind of public liminality where social structure and hierarchies are temporarily dissolved, taking you back to my undergraduate ethnology lectures here. It is a live, temporary, egalitarian space between a present yet to pass and a future still to come, always in the making. In that moment, in that lived moment, there is a kind of liminal possibility. It is a source of creativity, of resolve, transformation and insurrection. The carrying stream then can be understood as a string of these moments of conviviality. They embody an ineffable creative power, an organic energy, a life force. These are the spaces and places where the impulse and catalyst for resistance and change is to be found, the courage to believe in things not yet manifest. Connections are made, enthusiasm and inspiration can be found or renewed, and I'm sure many of us will be able to bring to mind an experience in our own lives that has stuck with us. In an essay on geopoetics, Alistair McIntosh writes, as activists for social, environmental and perhaps other forms of change, ours can be a bardic politics, the politics of a people resourced by their poetry. This is drawing very much on Henderson and the idea that poetry becomes people. But the use of poetry here goes beyond the use of literary expression. It includes song, of course, but also speaks to a deeper understanding of creativity as poesis, the poetic act of constantly making the world new. For Henderson, who was vociferously anti-fascist, it is a timeless and universal truth that both freedom and creative expression must be continually sought out and reaffirmed. For him, the carrying stream is a constant source available to artists, to activists, to all of us to remake and to renew. There are countless initiatives seeking alternative ways of living, working, organising and merging across the world today. People are stepping up to reclaim or invent new systems that function outside of this capitalist mindset for the mutual benefit and with respect for the earth. Many such initiatives, of course, have existed for decades in our own communities. That same energy and convivial life force is there in community land trusts, in community gardens and urban growing projects, cooperatives of all kinds, artist collectives, community and social enterprises, solidarity syndicates, alternative currencies, local exchange systems such as tool libraries, food sovereignty groups, slow food, mutual aid associations. And the beauty of these initiatives is that they meet needs in direct and empowering ways. A particularly inspiring example in recent days is from Glasgow, a few blocks away from the official action of COP26 on the south of the Clyde. A govern-free state was declared by Gal Gale more than 20 years after Colin MacLeod and the Pollock Free State in the 1990s. Standing with Indigenous people globally and in solidarity with those left vulnerable by the growing extremities of wealth, weather or other forms of violence, the declaration reads, "Every single life lost so far in the name of profit and imperial expansion is a crime. At this precise moment in time, we are now teetering at the edge of the complete devastation of all life on our common home, Earth." Centuries of colonialism, imperialism and capitalism have impoverished most of the world, destroyed cultures and ways of being and knowing which have been millennia in the making, devastated ecosystems and biospheres and led to the genocide of so many human and more than human beings that our hearts simply cannot fathom the scale of the loss and the pain. The Free State, evoking the tradition of hospitality and inspired explicitly by thinkers such as Henderson and the Freedom Kamoyi, explores questions of emancipation, independence and international reconciliation. Through shared space, through food, through music and song. It is a defiant declaration of hope, of intent, of solidarity, to counter fatalism and to fire the radical imagination. It also began the same time of year as Samhain, marking the end of the 4 quarters of the Celtic year, a time of waning light, a time for the death of old systems, and perhaps new beginnings. Conviviality, then, becomes a vital tool and praxis for radical transformation towards a more just and hopeful future. Creating these spaces, these non-commodified spaces, opens up opportunities for people to gather and to connect, to learn together, to interrogate our current systems, to imagine and rehearse alternative realities, a catalyst for further action. To step consciously then into the carrying stream is to participate in the endless flow that makes up human history and understanding. It is to stand in relation to our being here and now, to our past and to our future. Alistair McIntosh once told me, in the carrying stream, you have to swim for your life and swim for life. My title today is Heelstergowdie, Upendings and Hopeful Futures. But I'm not suggesting that we just keep hoping that the crisis will somehow resolve itself, hoping that governments or legislation or technology will fix things. They won't. The truth is that things are not going to be okay. They are already not okay, and they're going to get much worse. The last chance narrative of COP26 completely and intentionally alienates us from the process of change. Waiting for global leaders to act on our behalf and longing for a future condition over which we have no agency means we are essentially powerless. That kind of hope serves the interests of those who have a vested interest in more of the same, in business as usual. They want us to keep hoping. It keeps us blind to real possibilities for change. When we reach a point of truly understanding the scale, reality and implications of the climate emergency, when we realise that we will not find solutions in the systems and structures that have caused this crisis, when we realise that our leaders will not live up to their empty words and promises, our governments will not act in the way we need them to, only then can we be free. Only then can we claim the collective agency that we do have for transformation, for resolve, for peaceful insurrection. I'm drawing on words now from friends and colleagues at Enough. The climate movement's most significant task is helping people realise that we all have an active role to play. We can all dig where we stand, open out to new possibilities. Collective work and action, coordinated to places of genuine disruption to the workings of capitalism, sustained by the bonds of convivial community, resourced by culture and creativity. This is what has transformative potential. Unlocking this potential, the power of all of us together, is the story of renewal and radical hope that we need for this time. If both freedom and poetry can become people, a more hopeful future can become us all. Thank you.
Mairi saying that should some questions in, or comments, or anything that anybody wants to contribute in the light of what we just heard. Very powerful statement from Mairi there. Yeah, great.
It's not a question, it's a statement, and listening to the likes of Mairi gives me great hope for the future. And you know, this is what we need right now, the next generation taking on the mantle and really showing us the way forward. It's just fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if what most of us are involved in, music, song, culture, creativity. If in the light of the sort of state of the world and the state of society and communities, if what we're actually indulging in is a kind of collective psychotherapy, or if there's a role, if that could be the role for arts and culture in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm familiar with that terminology, but I think we'd be absolutely lost without it. I think, yes, absolutely. Where would we be? Where would we be?
Yeah.
To say that the talk was really inspiring, because that's exactly what we need. That's the programme, that's the agenda for the future that we need. But I also find it deeply troubling, because the political action that would be necessary to achieve that is becoming clearer and clearer to us that that's going to have to be very, very confrontational and potentially violent. I think it's something that, without being too dramatic about it, Hamish Henderson's political awakening came when he had a gun on his hand, when he was at war. So I was just interested how you've wrestled with that kind of contradiction between that politics of conviviality and flourishing and community and what will eventually get there.
Yeah, I mean, you raise massive questions for the future, and I think that is something that we're all struggling with. I think we're facing hugely turbulent times as a human species. I think when it comes to Henderson, yes, he might have been radicalised picking up a gun, but he had a lifelong commitment to pacifism, and that was part of his his way of being. And I think the degrowth vision and movement has pacifism absolutely at the heart of it. I think it would be naive of us to think that we're going to live through a century of anything less than deeply troubling times. The world is on the move. We're going to have millions of climate refugees in the coming years, and I think that it's our collective responsibility to stand up against this authoritarian, violent, the kind of hostile environment that we're already seeing today. It's not something that's happening in the future, it's happening now. I just think holding close to your ideals of pacifism or a peaceful movement is so important, but I don't have much faith that is the way that it's going to play out. I'm just relieved that I've actually managed to get through this without fully weeping, because when I practiced this in the past, I'm just overwhelmed. Anybody else? Oh.
Yeah, John Barrow, back now.
There was never mentioned in your talk, in the lecture, about the expanding population of the Earth, which is fairly fundamental to trying to control what is going on. Now we've got 8 billion at the moment, I think, is the current figure. That's going to increase. You're hardwired to procreate. It's a very difficult problem to overcome.
It is a difficult problem, but if we look at the statistics, there was a report produced by Oxfam just last week. The responsibility for this lands with the ultra rich and I think that it's a convenient myth that population is a problem. The world can sustain more people, it just can't sustain the level of resource use that is currently in place. So I'm not a huge fan of the argument that population control is an answer to the climate crisis. I think it's the way that we live our lives. It's degrowth is calling for the wealthy to downscale. So yeah, I'm very suspicious of that argument, John. We could have a chat afterwards.
David? Yeah, can I? Yeah, sorry. Beyond the political side of COP26, do you not feel that some of the demonstrations and the events around it give some sort of hope? There is definitely a lot more voice now to these, and we just need, it's the political system that's the problem. But do you feel slightly hopeful after seeing what went on in Glasgow these last 2 weeks?
Yeah, well, I wasn't there, but you were, so it's fantastic. Yeah, and I think that the energy around, there was events and demonstrations in every nook and cranny. We were watching the live stream of them, Storm meeting the puppet Amal, incredible stuff. I had friends who were there doing workshops in degrowth, and there was so much happening I'm witnessing it just from a distance. That is where the energy is. I don't think I ever had any faith in the official diplomatic event itself. But yeah, no, you were there, you saw the stuff happening around Govern Free State. It gives people, it's energizing, it's motivating, and my husband and I were talking about this last night, that it's now, the language we need to hear is now being, in the mainstream, is being reported by the news. The language that we need to hear is no longer a fringe issue. And
it's also the young.
Well, yeah, I also
they're leading the planet in many ways.
Responsibility on the young people. The level of anxiety that our young people have on their shoulders. It's just, it's unbelievable. But yeah, the energy is there, and I think, looking to that radical heritage and history of activism that we do have in this country and all over the world, it can make change. We just have to keep doing it, although it's so difficult when it's always in protest, and that's all of these demonstrations. It's not that they're not hearing it. They know what they need to do. They're just not willing to act. It's intractable, and I suppose I have some sympathies for politicians who are in there doing their best, but the powers that be have a vested interest in people keeping hoping that things will change.
Yeah, I think there's been a long history of social progress has been about bringing concessions from power, but just in terms of what the gentleman in the front was saying here, we're at a delicate moment now, because the levers that have moved these concessions are now detached. So, and I first thought about that, the huge demonstrations in the Iraq War, millions of people on the streets that had not a bit of influence on the powers that be. So, you know, it could be that you know, we do turn in on ourselves and attempt to make the kind of, you know, organic, energetic society that you're talking about, but at the same time there has to be some connection between that and, you know, what Aline Goldbach calls a data stand, right? That kind of the prevailing system. And if that doesn't happen, then the chances are that people return to the kind of action that you're talking about. Donald, did that say?
Yeah, I just thinking about that discussion there. I thought we also got to remember we do have we still need the power of the international cooperation. We need international law. We need to advance, you know. So I think there's kind of two fronts in the battle. But what I really wanted to say was, I thought what I really liked about your talk, Mairi, was I think placing some of Hamish's really key songs and poems in that setting was fantastic, and it just showed how incredibly they are of now and of the future. It's just amazing to see the flighting of life and death, you know, think about it in the middle of that. So it's quite remarkable. That has to give a certain hope, doesn't it, that there's a kind of power of inspiration and energy and sort of a realised cultural passion there. And I just thought that was very striking, because it was fantastic to see all that and then to hear and see the words and think, God, this is not old hat, you know?
Well, that's, you know, Steve was saying absolutely at the vanguard. I think there's a quote, I can't think it was John Thacker or something, that, and I think you have to hold true to it, that, you know, the way that change happens, you know, it happens at the grassroots and communities at first, long before media leaders, business leaders, political leaders pick up on it. And you have to believe that shift and transformation is in process. And, you know, that you were talking about that connection between the two levels, that you know, you just have to hope that shift is, or I don't know, who knows. But I think as well it's being able to sit with those massive, you know, complexities or contradictions where, you know, have very little hope that things are going to get better, but at the same time, you know, you have to, I suppose that's the that's the internal conflict, isn't it, that you have to hold these things together.
So we've got grandpas and mothers and grannies. I think we need their power. That's what came through to that.
Well, yeah, you know, going through all of this and the global pandemic, I know, you know, Laurie's in the audience, we both had our babies in the midst of all of this, you know, having to process and make sense of it all, and becoming a mother and how that changes, you know, just your sense of your own power is quite incredible. So yeah, more energy of the grannies and the mothers and the grandpas.
Any other points? Yeah, there's the gentleman there, and then was that you, Pam?
Another one at the front and another one at the back.
Yeah,
Two at the back.
Two at the back. The very back first, then the next row, and then we'll go to Dolly.
It's just a thought there is that the power blocks in the world, but basically capitalism has always been the beast. Is there any sign of, say, not so much the tech boys, because they are girls, they are the full sales officers, but is there any sign of anyone breaking ranks? Because you thinking, they're always, you know, very intelligent people, with their fingers on the pulse, just drawing the blank. I'm not talking to concept, I'm talking about, say, something in it for me, i.e. the world, the people of the world, the poor, not just another foundation stone stuck for themselves everywhere you go. Is there any sign of the people with influence, Chomsky years and years ago, like with language, he did it with language, there's many other instances there. But within the capitalist system, the gross capitalism, is there anyone saying, we need you thinking here, because we're not going to space, we can't run away, and for nothing else, it's like the guy with the axe at the door, right? There's nowhere to hide. Is there anything within your own movement and things too, where people are thinking twice or three times? Basically coming over, and there'll be something in it for them, life, their family, continuity.
I'm not sure I completely heard you, but I'm sure there are. I'm not sure I could give you any particular examples, but I still don't think that we can rely on business or technology to, work our way out of this. It might make things less bad, but we need a complete shift of and radical restructuring of everything. We have to change everything in order to change anything. People acting out of self-interest in order to make a difference. Yes, this will happen, but it won't solve the problem. And I mean, who am I to say that? It's just where I'm standing and my own thoughts. I mean, technology. I think a lot of people are just have their fingers crossed that technology will somehow get us out of this mess. I don't know.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know.
Man in the back row, do you have?
The lady in the back row.
Yes,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
There's another one here now as well.
Nielsen, we'll take you first, and then the lady, and then Dolly.
Just on a practical level.
Could you take your mask off for the?
Sorry. Yeah, just on a practical level, your talk was really amazing. Where can we go to learn more about degrowth and its sort of practical implications and implementation?
Oh, that's the best question. That's what I hoped you were going to ask. With the Centre for Human Ecology, we run an online course, and we have put together with European friends Lorenzo Vallotti from Italy and Martin Krobath from Germany, incredible handbook, which is this huge document of all the key readings and everything. That's freely available, Creative Commons license, and we've got journal. You can take away a journal today, and all the information is in there. And we're trying to catalyse a network across Scotland, so there'll be events happening. If you want to come in, I'll ping you my email and I'll bombard you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. What you have said today, Mairi, has reawakened hope and energy in me. It is such a massive thing to be facing. It's so overwhelming. But we mustn't let ourselves be overwhelmed, because you have to do whatever you can in your own way from where you're standing, as you say. Now, the lady over there rightly said it was wonderful to see the younger generation taking up the mantle, but we must not let go of it. The older ones, like you say, the grannies and all the other people, yeah, it's, it is so overwhelming that it would be so easy just to hide under the downy, wouldn't it? Really would. But where do you start? And now you've given us a lot of ideas about where to start, and I'll be down there to get a copy of that publication you have. Those of us who are here are with you. It's those of us, the population who are not here, who also need to hear this, and I'm so glad you're going to have it's being live streamed. But just to conclude, a very simple thing. It's easy to feel so overwhelmed, but if each one of us does a little bit more to up our game, or in a way, to down our game, to use less, to buy less, to grow more, to do whatever we can in our own small corner, it's the only way to make a step. You can only start from where you stand. Thank you very much.
Dolly.
Thank you very much for putting the Cayley back in its place. Okay. When I was growing up, you went to Cayley on somebody and you brought your knitting,
Yeah,
there'd be a sailor back home and he would bring us tales from all over the place. But also your thing about technology, we can't do without it now, but I think it put an end to conviviality, because television, for the start, stopped the Cayley, the house Cayleys. Well, the pubs opened late, that put the end to the after Cayleys, now everybody's on their phone, so conviviality is probably, possibly, as we used to know it, gone. But one thing that occurred to me when you were talking about progress is when the electricity came to our village in the 1950s, there was this amazing woman, and she used to put the light on while she lit the tilly. So I think she had the right idea. It's there, but use it properly.
with regard, I think, as part of this lady's comment here, I would suggest that you get the government that you vote for. And to some extent, I mean, it's a massive problem, I quite agree. It's the biggest problem. And to some extent, anyway, to a large extent, it'll come from above what the solutions are, as we've been trying to get people to talk to each other at COP26. But at the same time, it's that kind of thing on the screen there, that the people who have got the right to vote have got to use it.
Yeah, but John, we don't have the government we voted for.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Well, I didn't vote for
And the room is open for debate.
And that feeds into the capitalism, because at the moment, of course, we have a government which will be inclined naturally to support capitalism. And it seems to me that the economics becomes a binary question, as I think you would put it these days, that it's either capitalism or it's not capitalism, unless we can find some kind of hybrid, another fashionable word. And I don't know what that is, but capitalism is certainly out of control. When you read in the press that in America in the last 18 months, 2 years through COVID, that the number of billionaires has increased, well, I don't know what it is, by 10% or something like that. Now, why did people need that much money? How many options can you buy with the kind of money that you have in that?
I hear wallpaper is particularly expensive.
Space.
But if money allows you to have options, which is sometimes a way of describing the value of money, how many super yachts do you need? How many helicopters do you need? And it strikes me that the government, again, well, certainly in America, and probably in this country too, are just so relaxed about allowing people to amass that kind of money. My own feeling is that everybody should get paid the same. And the contracts you have with your employer, the balance between your contracted £1 million per year and, I don't know what wage you would actually get paid, should all just go to the Chancellor. And then you don't have capitalism anymore.
Okay, I'm conscious that time is wearing on, so we'll maybe just draw a line under the question. Just before I do a proper vote of thanks for Mairi, I'm going to invite Steve to come back up onto the stage and close out in a classic Hamish Henderson fashion.
This is a new song called Ban the Billionaires. Never there was an evergreen song, this is it. Rough the wind and the clear days are round, was the blues, Heelstergowdie, out of bay. But there's men on a rough wind blowing through the great rain of the day. It's a thought that we are a rotten, all they robes the young fresh and gay. Tag the roll and stick at our loading, for their own lives they sport and play. Nay, ne'er will the bonny callants match they war when old braggart loosely crawl. Nor we wings play with heed and bargain on the ships sailing in the gloomy hall. Broken families and lands we've had, welcome Scotland in the rain, they Oh, come on, ye, and him with freedom. Never heed what the police rope and do. And your goose on the bins of Adam won't find bleed by you being painted blue. And when McFadyen meets with his friends and Strangburn, all they roses and beads of touting bloom. And the black boy frae thinks the bell comes to the burglars to
Thank you, Steve. And a few other thanks in addition. Our huge thanks to the Scottish Storytelling Centre for the facilities this afternoon. And to Sandy McGee, who's handled all the live streaming side of things. Many thanks to you. Alan McMillan has been up there taking photos, which should be appearing on Facebook anytime soon. Thanks to Maria for the tech side of things, but especially for all of the hope and the inspiration, and certainly for situating Hamish Henderson, his thought and his work, right at the centre of the current situation and crisis that we're facing. A huge thanks to our speaker, the 2021 Hamish Henderson Annual Lecturer, Mairi McFadyen.